Cassandra Doyle had just finished logging vitals for her usual round of long-term patients when her supervisor called her into the office. It was an unusual request, one she hadn't seen coming. After over a decade of working the general care floors at Ridgeview Senior Living Center, Cassandra was being reassigned to the third floor, to a VIP private suite. The name listed was Nathan Lowell. She knew the name, like everyone else who'd worked in the facility longer than a few months. Lowell had been admitted quietly 2 weeks earlier, though his presence quickly became a quiet legend among staff. Once the CEO of a sprawling investment firm, Lowell had been diagnosed with end-stage pancreatic cancer. His assets were in the hundreds of millions. His personal life, however, was non-existent. No spouse, no children, no family visits, and most notably, no patients for anyone. 3 staff members had already rotated through his care team. None lasted more than a few days. Cassandra hadn't asked for the assignment. She didn't know why it was handed to her. The supervisor's instruction was vague, only emphasizing that Mr. Lowell was particular and that his comfort was the facility's priority. Still, Cassandra wasn't the type to argue. She nodded, took the file, and made her way up to the third floor. It was the wing designed for clients who could afford privacy, luxury, and staff who wouldn't ask questions. Cassandra had never set foot in any of those suites before. Lowell's room was quiet, not in the peaceful sense, but in the way a boardroom might go quiet before a difficult negotiation. He was propped slightly upright in his bed, not asleep, not resting, simply waiting. Cassandra greeted him calmly, introduced herself, explained her role, and moved into routine care. He didn't respond at first. No hello, no thank you. He watched her like someone used to evaluating people for a living. His silence wasn't hostile, it was analytical. For the first few days, that was their rhythm. She performed her duties. He tolerated her presence. There was no conversation. Only acknowledgement, brief and dry. Cassandra didn't try to change that. Her job wasn't to make friends. It was to do her work professionally and without unnecessary disruption. But by the end of the first week, something in the air had shifted. She entered the room one morning and found him already awake, looking toward the door before she even knocked. She asked the standard question about pain levels, and for the first time, he answered with a full sentence rather than a number. A few days later, he made a passing remark, something benign but notable for its tone. "You've got steady hands," he said. That was it. But in the world of Nathan Lowell, it was the equivalent of a compliment. Cassandra acknowledged the change, but didn't make it a focal point. Still, she began staying a little later after her shift ended, especially on nights when Lowell's discomfort seemed heightened. The overnight team didn't question it. No one did. Yet as days went by, it became noticeable. What also became noticeable was Lowell's response to her presence. He didn't smile, he didn't chat, but he watched the clock. He seemed calmer when she was the one adjusting his IV or checking his temperature. His voice was less guarded. He stopped making demands. In a place where patients often lashed out from fear or frustration, Lowell simply became less sharp. Around the third week, Cassandra's colleagues began to talk. It started small. A joke about how she'd hit the jackpot with her new patient. A question about her recent phone upgrade. A curious glance at the shoes she wore to work. New, when they'd all worn the same pairs for months. Then came the whispers. Someone said Lowell was giving her money. Monthly. Thousands. No one had proof. But in a building where stress was constant and gratitude rare, the idea of one nurse receiving special treatment spread like spilled bleach. Cassandra noticed the shift, though no one said anything outright. She wasn't invited to lunch anymore. Hallway greetings became curt. Even her supervisor, who once trusted her judgment blindly, began asking oddly specific questions about how long she spent with her patient and whether tasks were logged by the book. Cassandra didn't understand it fully, but she didn't have time to investigate either. Her attention was on Mr. Lowell. His vitals were fluctuating more often, his appetite shrinking. The disease was progressing, and she was one of the few people who saw it firsthand. She never asked him about the rumors. She didn't explain herself to coworkers. There was nothing to explain. She wasn't being paid by Lowell. In fact, she hadn't accepted anything from him beyond the minimal verbal exchanges they shared. But she understood how perception worked. She also knew that the man in room 3A was dying alone, and if her extra care gave him a few hours of peace, she wasn't going to let gossip interfere. Lowell never mentioned the shift either. He kept his focus on the day-to-day, though he grew more open with time. He asked once where she went after her shift. Cassandra only said she had somewhere to be. He didn't pry. He never called her Cassandra, always Miss Doyle. But once, near the end of the month, he said, "It's good that you're here." It wasn't said softly. It wasn't an emotional moment. Just a fact, delivered as if it had passed through a dozen internal filters before being spoken aloud. She said nothing in response. But she stayed 10 minutes longer than she needed to that night. The phone started buzzing just past 6 p.m. Cassandra had just stepped out of the patient lounge when she saw 3 missed calls and a message from Alicia, one of the night nurses. There was nothing urgent in the message, just a casual reminder. Check the group thread when you get a minute. Something wild about 3A. She opened the group chat. One of the nurses had taken a blurry photo of a designer handbag sitting near the nurse's station. Another had posted a close-up of a new iPhone screen, the latest model. Someone else added, "Guess who's not clocking out on time these days?" Then the final blow. Word is she's getting $5K a month from the old man upstairs, extra services and all that. The chat exploded with reactions, laughing emojis, shocked gifs, even one sarcastic, "Wonder if I can get reassigned to 3A too." No one said her name, but everyone knew who the jokes were about. Cassandra stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. She closed the app and walked back to the 3rd floor. When she stepped into Mr. Lowell's room, he was asleep, or pretending to be. She adjusted the IV flow and quietly sat at the corner of the room, waiting for his breathing to settle. His face looked drawn, paler than usual. He hadn't eaten much during the day. She'd reported it during shift change, but the head nurse had only nodded, flipping through the chart with an expression Cassandra couldn't read. "Has he eaten today?" she'd asked earlier. "Half a banana," Cassandra had answered. "Refused lunch." The head nurse didn't look up, not unusual for his stage. Then, as Cassandra turned to leave, the tone sharpened. "Why are you still here? Shift ended 30 minutes ago. Let me guess, you're just that dedicated." Cassandra blinked. "His fever hasn't gone down. I was going to give it another hour before calling the doctor." The head nurse gave a flat smile. "Right, of course. An hour for medical reasons, not for special arrangements." She didn't reply. There was no point. Back in the room, Lowell stirred a little, but didn't wake. Cassandra glanced at the monitor, then at the bag she'd brought with her, a plain canvas tote with a paperback, a thermos, and a bus schedule. She still had 2 stops before she'd get home. But something told her not to leave just yet. In the hallway, the whispers grew louder. Even nurses she'd mentored now avoided eye contact. One orderly muttered under his breath as she passed. At first, Cassandra told herself it was just hospital fatigue. But by the time she entered the break room and heard the silence that fell mid-conversation, it was undeniable. One of the new CNAs looked up and blurted out, "Oh, hi, Miss Doyle. We were just..." Then she trailed off and busied herself with a coffee lid that didn't need adjusting. The worst wasn't the whispers. It was the shift in tone. Before, her name had carried a kind of quiet respect. Now it was curiosity, suspicion, and silent judgment. Cassandra didn't confront anyone. Instead, she kept doing the work. Pain logs, IV adjustments, turning charts, and meal monitoring. Every night she waited for the call that never came, that someone else would take over 3A. But it didn't happen. If anything, her assignment remained locked in. What none of them knew was what Cassandra did after work. When she left the hospital, she didn't go home. She took the 7:45 bus to the edge of town, to a small memory care facility tucked behind a strip mall. That was where her mother had been living for the past 4 years. Early-onset Alzheimer's had taken its toll fast. At first, Linda Doyle had lost names, then birthdays, then faces. Now, she barely recognized her own daughter. Every visit was the same. Cassandra sat beside her for an hour or two, talking into the silence, hoping a familiar phrase might spark a reaction. Some nights, she got a smile. Most nights, she didn't. One evening, after a difficult shift, the facility director pulled Cassandra aside. He was apologetic, but firm. "Starting next month," he said, "we're raising the monthly cost by 10%. It's the only way we can keep up with staffing and supplies." Cassandra said nothing. She just nodded. But the math rattled through her head the whole ride home. 10% meant nearly $200 extra. On top of the 1,700 she was already struggling to pay. Her savings were gone. The credit cards were creeping upward, and her part-time job at the pharmacy wasn't cutting it anymore. That night, she opened her bank app and stared at the balance. $52. The phone buzzed. Another auto draft coming up for a utility bill she couldn't cover. She turned off the screen and leaned back, thinking of her son Brandon, who had just started his medical residency in a small-town hospital hours away. He barely made enough to cover rent and student loans. She hadn't told him about any of this. He had enough on his plate. She walked to the fridge. It was mostly empty. Tomorrow was payday, and payday meant just enough to get by until the next disaster. Her fingers lingered on the worn photograph taped to the fridge, Brandon in his white coat, smiling on the day he got his license. She hadn't been able to buy a frame, so she'd taped it up with masking tape. She grabbed her phone and called the overnight manager at the pharmacy. "Hi, it's Cassandra," she said. "I can pick up more shifts if you need me, even weekdays. Whatever's open." She didn't explain. She never did. The next morning, she arrived early at Ridgeview. Her name was still on the board for 3A. No changes, no questions. She picked up the clipboard, walked to the elevator, and headed upstairs to check on Mr. Lowell. The rumors would keep spinning. The glances would follow her through the halls, but her work remained the same. And no matter what anyone said, Cassandra Doyle knew why she stayed. It was a Thursday afternoon when Cassandra spotted Brandon in the hospital lobby, wearing his white coat and scanning the room like he was searching for someone. She wasn't supposed to be on the first floor at that hour. She'd forgotten her badge in the locker room and had doubled back from her lunch break when she saw him standing near the elevator, confused, looking out of place. She stopped, surprised. He hadn't told her he was coming. They spoke maybe once a week by phone, just check-ins between his long shifts. He looked up, spotted her, and smiled. "I had a conference in town," he said. "One of the senior doctors at my hospital used to work here. Said I should stop by, surprise you." Cassandra smiled back, heart racing. She hadn't seen him in nearly 5 months. "I have a few hours before I need to catch my flight," he continued. "Thought maybe we could grab dinner?" She hesitated. She didn't have any shifts at the pharmacy tonight. There was nothing standing in the way except one thing. She hadn't finished evening meds for Mr. Lowell. "I just need to finish one thing first," she said. "Then, dinner." He nodded. "Mind if I come up with you?" She didn't say no. They stepped into the elevator together. Brandon didn't ask many questions, just listened as she explained that she was handling a high-care patient in 3A. "End-stage pancreatic," she added. Not a lot of time left. The door opened, and they walked down the quiet hallway. She knocked lightly, then entered. Lowell was awake, sitting slightly upright, reading something on a tablet. He glanced up, expecting her, then hesitated at the sight of Brandon behind her. "Mr. Lowell," she said, "this is my son, Brandon. He's a doctor now, internal medicine." Lowell gave a small nod. "Good to meet you." Brandon stepped forward. "Likewise, sir." Something shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Cassandra saw it. Lowell's eyes lingered on Brandon longer than usual, like a memory was pulling at the edge of his expression. They spoke briefly. Lowell asked where Brandon had trained. Brandon answered politely, mentioning the scholarship that had gotten him through med school. "The New Hope Foundation," he said, "helped cover most of my tuition. I wouldn't have made it without it." Cassandra froze. She hadn't heard that name in years. Brandon rarely brought it up. He had always been grateful, but quiet about where the money had come from. Lowell blinked. "New Hope Foundation?" he repeated. "You received aid through them?" "Yes, sir," Brandon said. "I was one of the recipients during their 5th cycle. I still remember the letter. It changed everything." Lowell looked to Cassandra. "You never told me that." Cassandra didn't answer. She hadn't known. Brandon, curious now, walked toward the table beside the bed. There, in a small frame, was a black and white photo of a much younger Nathan Lowell standing with a group of men in suits. Brandon leaned in. "This photo, where was it taken?" he asked. Lowell squinted. "That's the original board of the foundation, maybe 25 years ago. A reunion photo." Brandon's voice was quiet, steady. "You founded it?" Lowell nodded. "After I retired from the firm. Seemed like the only thing worth doing after money stopped mattering." Brandon stared at him. Then, it was you. You're the reason I'm a doctor. Cassandra stepped back slightly, unsure of what to say. Her mind raced through 100 details: financial aid forms, the tight years before the scholarship, the relief when Brandon got the acceptance letter. She had never thought to ask where the money had come from. It had just been a lifeline. Lowell didn't respond immediately, but he looked at Brandon with a kind of astonishment that didn't match his usual detachment. "You're Cassandra's son," he said slowly. "The kid who used to leave lunchbox notes in the staff fridge, the one she kept working night shifts for." Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I had no idea," Cassandra said finally. "I didn't know the foundation was yours." Lowell let out a low breath. "Neither did I. Funny how things circle back." Brandon sat down briefly near the foot of the bed. "I've always wanted to thank the person behind that scholarship. I didn't expect to do it today." Lowell gave a quiet nod. "You earned it. I just wrote the checks." But something had changed in the room. A thread had tightened, pulling people together who didn't realize they'd been connected all along. Cassandra cleared her throat. "We should go. Let you rest." But Lowell shook his head. "Stay, both of you, a little longer." That evening over dinner, Brandon shared more stories from residency. He spoke about his patients, the long hours, the pressure. Cassandra listened with quiet pride, watching him describe a world she'd sacrificed everything for him to enter. When he left for the airport, he hugged her hard and told her he'd call Sunday. She didn't tell him how much she needed to hear that. The next morning, Lowell asked about Brandon, what his specialty was, where he worked. Then he said something Cassandra hadn't expected. "I remember your son's application. There was a line in it, something about wanting to take care of people the way his mother did." Cassandra swallowed. "He meant it." "I know," Lowell said. "I can see that now." He looked away then, thoughtful. "Miss Doyle," he said, "I've done a lot of things in my life. Built companies, made money, lost friends. But helping that foundation, that might have been the only thing that mattered." She didn't reply. But when she left the room that morning, she paused at the door longer than usual. Something had shifted. Not just in him, in her too. The rain started just after dinner, and by the time Cassandra was finishing up her last check-in for the night, the sound of it pattering against the windows echoed through the third floor. Most of the patients were already asleep. She stayed behind in Lowell's room, quietly documenting his vitals and monitoring his response to the new pain regimen. He hadn't spoken much that day. His appetite had dropped again, and though he hadn't complained, the signs were obvious: fatigue, shortness of breath, increasing jaundice. The disease was progressing. She was just about to dim the light when his voice broke through the quiet. "You ever get dreams that aren't dreams? Just old memories you didn't ask for?" Cassandra paused. "Sometimes. Rain does it to me," he said. "Always has." She didn't respond, just listened. "I was 5. The war was just noise to me back then. Shouting, marching, orders. My parents kept me close. We were living outside Paju when it got bad. Word came that the Northern patrols were closing in. Families were leaving in groups, small ones. We packed what we could. I remember the weight of a blanket wrapped around my head and my mother whispering in my ear to stay quiet." He closed his eyes for a second. "We made it up into the hills. Forests, rocks, barely a trail to follow. There were 30 of us, maybe more. Old people, children. It rained that night too. Hard. The kind of rain that makes you think the sky wants to wash everything clean." He stopped for a moment, as if checking whether the memory was his or something he'd borrowed. "There was a man from the village. I don't remember how he joined us. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Tall, serious. Didn't speak unless it was important. He kept us moving, made decisions, knew the hills better than anyone. His name was Frank Doyle." Cassandra's breath caught. "He led us to a crevice near a slope, said it'd be tight but safe from a distance. We squeezed in, could barely breathe, but we were hidden. Then we heard dogs, Northern patrols, real close. That's when Frank said he'd go." Lowell's voice dropped. "He looked at my mother and told her to cover my mouth if anything happened. Told us all not to move, no matter what. Then he stepped out, just walked away." The rain outside thickened, a backdrop to the silence inside the room. A few minutes later, we heard shouting, dogs barking, then 3 gunshots. My father gripped my shoulder so tight I couldn't breathe. But we didn't move. We stayed until dawn. When we climbed out, Frank was gone. He finally looked up at her. We never found his body. My father searched for days. We buried his coat. Cassandra didn't say anything at first. Her hands trembled slightly, but she gripped the edge of the chart tighter. My grandfather's name, she said slowly, was Frank Doyle. Lowell stared at her, confused. She nodded. He never came home. My grandmother raised their daughter alone. That daughter was my mother. Silence stretched across the room like a drawn string. You're his granddaughter? Lowell's voice cracked. Yes. He sat still, trying to process it. His mouth opened slightly, closed again. Then, finally, 70 years. I never forgot his name, never stopped wondering what happened to his family. Cassandra's throat tightened. We never knew who he saved. We only knew he never came back. Lowell covered his mouth, then dropped his hand. I always thought I'd die not knowing, he said. She stepped closer. Now you do. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air had changed, not just in the room, but in everything surrounding it. Decades of questions, of unspoken gratitude, of inherited silence. My mother talked about him, Cassandra said. She couldn't remember his face, but she remembered the story. Said he gave his life for strangers. They weren't strangers to him, Lowell whispered. He looked us in the eye before he left. He knew what he was doing. She nodded. She told me the same. He looked at her then, truly looked. And now, you're the one taking care of me. She nodded again. I didn't know, she said, until just now. Lowell leaned back. His breathing was shallow but even. How strange. The man who saved my life. His granddaughter is the one making sure I don't die alone. She looked down. It's not strange. It's how things are supposed to end. He gave a soft exhale, not quite a sigh. You were always familiar. I just didn't know why. The rain slowed outside, though neither of them noticed. I wish I could have thanked him, Lowell said. Properly. You just did, Cassandra replied. There was no need for more words that night, only the knowledge that something once broken had, after so many years, been made whole. The next morning, Cassandra requested early leave from her supervisor. It wasn't a formal shift day, and she explained it was personal. She didn't offer details. The permission was granted with a shrug and a glance at the clock. She caught the 8:10 bus headed west out of the city. The route wound through residential streets before merging into the long corridor of warehouses and commuter lots that led to Green Hollow Memory Center. She hadn't told anyone about what had happened the night before, hadn't spoken a word of it to Brandon, hadn't even written it down. But something inside her insisted that her mother had to hear it. The receptionist smiled when Cassandra entered, recognizing her from countless previous visits. You're early today, the woman said. Cassandra nodded. Just finished up my morning rounds. She's in her room, the receptionist added. Ate a little bit this morning. Seems calm. Calm had become a relative term over the last few years. Linda Doyle had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's just before her 60th birthday. At first, there were misplaced items, forgotten names, repeated conversations, but it escalated quickly. Within 18 months, she no longer recognized her neighbors. Within 2 years, she couldn't follow a sentence. These days, she mostly stared out the window, eyes unfocused, mouth still, hands folded on her lap. Cassandra found her just like that, seated by the window, head tilted slightly toward the morning light. She didn't react when her daughter entered, didn't turn when Cassandra wheeled the second chair close beside her. I have something to tell you, Cassandra said softly. I know you might not understand, but I want you to hear it. She held her mother's hand, not for warmth, not out of habit, but to stay anchored to what came next. I met someone, Mom. Someone who remembers Grandpa Frank. There was no change in Linda's face, no flicker of recognition. Cassandra continued anyway. He's an old man now, sick, end-stage cancer. He's in my care. But 70 years ago, he was a child hiding in a mountain during the war. Grandpa saved him, led his family to safety, distracted the soldiers, took the bullets. She paused, and that man never forgot. He remembered Grandpa's name, Frank Doyle. He told me the story last night. Still nothing from Linda. He spent his whole life wondering what happened to us, to Grandpa's family. And now he knows. He said he thought he'd die without ever saying thank you. Cassandra looked at her mother's face again, the same blank stare, same stillness. But then, movement. A small twitch of the fingers, almost too subtle to notice. Cassandra froze. Mom? She whispered. Linda blinked. Her gaze shifted slightly. It didn't land on Cassandra, not exactly, but it wasn't vacant anymore. He was good, she said, the words rasped, barely audible. Cassandra's heart skipped. Linda's voice came again, clearer this time. My father. He always said, if someone's in trouble, you help, no matter what it costs. Tears welled in Cassandra's eyes, but she didn't speak. She just waited. Linda's hand moved again, slower now. You found him? Yes, Cassandra replied. I did. Her mother exhaled, long and low. He'll be proud, so proud of you. Cassandra sat there for a long time, listening to her mother's breathing, uncertain how long this window of clarity would last. Eventually, the light in Linda's eyes dimmed again. The stillness returned. But something had passed between them, something that had waited decades to be said. Later that afternoon, Cassandra rode back into the city. The sky had cleared. Her chest felt hollow and full all at once. The next morning, she returned to Ridgeview early. When she stepped into Lowell's room, he was awake, pale, worn, but lucid. I told her, she said. My mother. His lips curled slightly. Did she remember? Just for a minute. But yes, she remembered everything. Lowell closed his eyes. Good. That afternoon, he called his attorney. It took 3 days to arrange the paperwork. Lowell met with his legal team once, briefly, in the privacy of his room. The details were handled with efficiency. He gave instructions clearly, precisely. He wanted to establish a new foundation, separate from the existing one. A name had already been chosen, the Frank Doyle Memorial Trust. The funds would be allocated toward children of war veterans, particularly those orphaned or displaced by conflict. He named Cassandra as chairwoman of the board and granted her full authority over operational decisions. A separate account was created to cover Linda Doyle's care in full, transferring her to a leading neurological facility with a specialization in advanced dementia cases. He signed everything without hesitation. Once the attorney left, Lowell looked at Cassandra with something approaching finality. I don't believe in ghosts, he said, but I do believe in debts, and I've carried one for 70 years. You've paid it now, she replied. He gave a faint nod. Maybe. In the days that followed, he seemed lighter, not healthier. His condition was still deteriorating, but more present. He asked questions, shared stories from his early business ventures, spoke about the years he'd lost to chasing money and the people he hadn't kept close. He mentioned the other children the original foundation had helped and how, for a long time, he thought that was enough. But it wasn't personal, he said. This is. Cassandra visited even on her off days. She sat with him in the evening, listened when he talked, stayed when he fell asleep. The staff still whispered. Some avoided her altogether, but the sting of it had faded. She no longer cared about what they thought. She knew the truth now. She knew who she was caring for, and why. Lowell once asked, "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe in full circles," she said. He liked that answer. And so the days passed, quiet, steady, filled with something neither of them had words for. Something that had begun in a gunshot on a rainy night 70 years ago and ended in a hospital room where time was running out. The rain came back on a Thursday night. It wasn't a storm, not this time, just a steady drizzle that clung to the windows, soft and persistent. Most of the hospital had gone quiet. Patients were asleep. Staff moved slower, more cautious as the hours dragged toward midnight. Cassandra stayed late. Not because anyone asked her to, not because she was being paid for it, but because Mr. Lowell's breathing had changed. He hadn't eaten all day. The nurses noted it during shift turnover. His skin had gone more yellow, and his speech was slower, sometimes slurred. When she'd checked in that afternoon, he'd asked if she could stay a little longer that evening. He hadn't said why, so she stayed. She sat beside his bed watching the monitors. The morphine drip had been adjusted earlier in the day, but his pain still spiked in waves. He refused higher doses, said he didn't want to fade out before the end. Cassandra respected that. "Do you want me to call Dr. Green?" she asked. "No," he answered, voice thin. "I want to be awake for this." He didn't say what this was. Minutes passed. His breathing grew shallower. The rain ticked softly on the windowsill. Cassandra adjusted his blanket, turned down the lights, and moved the chair a little closer. "You said something once," he murmured, "that your son became a doctor." She nodded. "Brandon. You said he started because of a scholarship?" "Yes, from your foundation." He paused. "No, from your grandfather." Cassandra looked at him, not following. If Frank hadn't done what he did, That foundation wouldn't exist. I wouldn't have lived. I wouldn't have built anything. Your son is a doctor because your grandfather saved a little boy in the hills during a war. She didn't speak. He wasn't wrong. I thought I was paying forward a debt, Lowell continued, but it all just went back to you. Cassandra held his gaze. Then maybe it was supposed to. He gave a slow blink, as if trying to memorize her face. I want you to promise something. Anything, she said. When I'm gone, tell your mother thank you for remembering his name, for raising his story. I will. And tell her, he added, I was sorry that I didn't find you all sooner, that I didn't know how to look. Cassandra's throat tightened. You found us when it mattered. Lowell didn't respond. He stared out at the dim light behind the curtain, barely visible in the rain. Then he said, I feel lighter. She watched the monitor. His vitals were unsteady, heart rate slowing. He closed his eyes. I've been waiting for this, he said, for so long. I know, she whispered. Don't leave yet. I won't. The minutes crept forward. He drifted in and out. Sometimes he muttered names, other times numbers, occasionally a word in Korean, old and faded. She didn't interrupt. She just sat, letting him know someone was still there. At 2:17 a.m., his breathing changed again, quieter, staggered. He opened his eyes once more. Tell Brandon I'm proud, he said. I will. And you, he added, you gave me peace. He closed his eyes, slower this time. A long breath followed. Then nothing. No beeping, no alarms, just stillness. Cassandra sat still for a long time. Then she reached for the call button. She spoke quietly when the night nurse answered. There was no urgency in her voice, just clarity. After the staff came, after the room was prepared, after the paperwork began, Cassandra stayed behind one last time. She placed a folded note on the nightstand, something she had written weeks earlier without knowing when she'd use it. Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for honoring him. We remember you too. She stepped out into the hallway. A few nurses gave her nods, some respectful, others uncertain. The air felt heavier than usual. The next day, the hospital received formal notification from Lowell's legal team. His estate would fund the full establishment of the Frank Doyle Memorial Trust. The papers had already been filed. The trust would be chaired by Cassandra Doyle. A separate endowment had been created to cover Linda Doyle's medical care for the rest of her life. In the weeks that followed, stories began to spread through the hospital. Not rumors this time, but truths. A few staff members apologized. Others asked quiet questions about Lowell's final days. Cassandra answered only what she felt was necessary. She no longer stayed after her shifts, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was no one in room 3A anymore. She visited her mother the following Sunday. The sun was out for the first time in days. Cassandra wheeled her to the garden patio, the one with the benches and the low hedges. I have something to tell you, she said softly. He passed, but he remembered everything. He asked me to thank you. Her mother blinked. The clarity was gone again, but Cassandra continued. He remembered Grandpa Frank, and now everyone else will too. There was no answer, only the gentle wind brushing past. Later that afternoon, Cassandra returned home and opened her email. A message from the foundation's legal team waited. The trust account had been activated. First public event scheduled, 1 year from Lowell's passing. The board would meet next month. She closed the laptop. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet, not lonely. That night, as the rain came again in short bursts against the roof, Cassandra lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He was gone, but he'd left something behind. Not just a legacy, a return, a debt paid in full. 1 year later, under a clear spring sky, the Frank Doyle Memorial Trust held its official opening ceremony in the heart of downtown Boston. The building was modest but modern, nestled between an outpatient clinic and a community college campus. A crowd gathered out front, trust staff, former scholarship recipients, veterans' families, reporters, and local officials. Some had traveled across the state. Others had waited decades for something like this to exist. Cassandra stood near the front steps, one hand resting lightly on the back of her mother's wheelchair. Linda was dressed in a soft blue cardigan, her expression vacant but peaceful. Cassandra had hoped for a rare moment of clarity, but it hadn't come that morning. Still, she brought her anyway. Brandon joined them moments before the ceremony began. He had taken time off from the hospital and now volunteered at one of the trust's free clinics twice a week. He adjusted his tie, nodded toward the podium. You ready? Cassandra nodded. As I'll ever be. A staff member motioned toward her, and she made her way to the front, standing before a row of microphones. Cameras clicked. Phones lifted. She cleared her throat once and began. Thank you for being here, she said. This place exists because of one man's sacrifice and another man's promise to never forget it. She paused. My grandfather, Frank Doyle, didn't carry a title. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't wealthy. He was a farmer's son from western Massachusetts who happened to be in the right or maybe wrong place during the Korean War. One night, he made a choice. He walked into danger so others could walk out of it. Cassandra glanced down, collected herself, then continued. Among those he saved was a child. That child grew up to become a business leader, a philanthropist, and the founder of the original New Hope Foundation. Decades later, dying of cancer, that same man remembered my grandfather's name. He found me, and through that connection, he gave me the opportunity to carry on both their legacies. She looked toward the front row, where veterans sat beside young scholarship students. This center will serve displaced children, survivors of war, families fractured by conflict. It will also offer healthcare, food access, and education support to those who need it most. Not in exchange for anything, simply because that's what someone once did for us. Applause followed. She stepped down quietly. Brandon gave her a small nod. Linda didn't react, but Cassandra leaned close and whispered anyway. He'd be proud of you, Mom. Of both of us. After the ribbon was cut, the guests were invited inside. The building had been designed with openness in mind. No grand halls, just functional rooms bathed in natural light. In the center of the lobby stood a glass case holding 2 framed photographs. On the left, a portrait of Frank Doyle, reconstructed from family memories and the few scraps of surviving documentation. He looked to be in his early 30s, eyes serious but kind, features drawn from the oral histories Cassandra had carried her whole life. On the right was Nathan Lowell. Not the powerful CEO version, but the image taken weeks before his death, smiling faintly, no longer burdened, seated in a wheelchair near the garden outside Ridgeview. Between the 2 photos, a plaque read, "A life given, a promise kept, a future built." Cassandra guided her mother's chair toward the display. Linda looked at the photos for a long time. Then, slowly, her lips moved. "Daddy," Cassandra blinked. Her hands tightened on the chair. "Mom?" Linda said nothing more. The word hung in the air, weightless and enormous all at once. That afternoon, Cassandra watched families file through the halls. She listened as one father explained to his daughter what a trust was. She saw a teenager sit beneath a mural in the children's reading room, flipping through a donated book. Brandon joined a small group of volunteers organizing medical kits. It all felt grounded. Real. Later, when the crowd had thinned, Cassandra returned to the wall with the inscription. A staffer stood nearby, arranging fresh flowers beneath the photographs. Your grandfather, the woman said, he must have been something. He was, Cassandra replied. So was Mr. Lowell. Funny how those 2 lives found each other again. Cassandra looked up at the words engraved in stone. Not funny, she said. I think it was always meant to happen. Outside, the sun began to dip. The street grew quieter. Cassandra stood still for a moment, her thoughts returning to that first quiet conversation in room 3A. To the man who never thought he'd get the chance to say thank you. To the man who never asked to be remembered, but was. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn now, creased from being carried too many times. A copy of the final letter Nathan Lowell had written before his passing. She opened it again, rereading the closing line. One person's sacrifice gave me everything. I hope in return I've given something back. Not to repay it, because that's impossible, but to prove it wasn't in vain. Cassandra tucked the paper away. Before she left, she placed her hand gently on the edge of the display. No words, just stillness. Outside, the air was cool. The sky above Boston was turning soft with twilight. As she walked her mother toward the waiting car, Cassandra looked back one last time. The building stood solid and warm against the street, its lights spilling softly across the sidewalk. A reminder that sometimes the smallest actions ripple across generations, that one person's courage can birth another's purpose, and that when gratitude and memory converge, they don't fade, they multiply. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. It means a great deal to us that you chose to spend a few moments of your day reflecting on something that truly matters. This story, like many others, reminds us that even the smallest acts of courage and kindness can ripple through generations. Sometimes it's not about changing the whole world, but about saving one life, keeping one promise, remembering one name. If that touched you, even a little, we're grateful. To support our channel, all you need to do is hit the like button. It helps more than you know, and we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below to tell us where you're watching from and how the story made you feel. Sharing your thoughts helps us stay connected across borders and cultures. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. We're building a space where real, meaningful stories are told and remembered. Your presence here makes that possible. Thank you again.